Nagbabalik po tayo dito sa Usapang Bayan at kasama pa rin natin ang Senior Advisor ng American Chamber of Commerce in the Philippines. So John, can you just tell us a little bit more about Arangkada Pilipinas and essentially what are its objectives, who decides what these objectives are, and what are your accomplishments so far?
No. A very good question, George, and I think I could probably spend the next 2 hours answering it.
We don't have that much
We don't
time,
have
but
much
you can give us
time,
the
so-
short version.
Well, again, the input for what we call the 7 big winter sectors, which earlier I mentioned, but I'll mention them again: agribusiness, business process, outsourcing, creative industries, infrastructure, manufacturing, logistics, mining, and tourism, including retirement and medical tourism. We had 9 individual focus group discussions. We had over 300 investors participate in that. Only a minority were foreign investors. The majority were, or a minority were American investors. The majority were Filipino and other foreign investors. And we asked, what are the challenges, and what you want to move the next mile, say on business processing at that point in time. What do you have to do? So we developed recommendations, and they totaled in the end 470 recommendations. For example, one of them was data privacy law. Another was in the BPO. Another was create a department of ICT. If we talked about in infrastructure, we looked at road and rail and power and water and telecommunications and ports and seaports and airports. So there are specific recommendations in all of these areas. The project is about advocacy. We're not investors, we don't have a fund to go into these areas, but we advocate investment climate reform. Now, we do get support from USAID. The USAID, the Australians, the World Bank, ADB, all of them engage in what you call economic reform projects. In fact, there's a big conference going on today down at the Diamond Hotel that involves a USAID project called SURGE, which is spending 2 days talking about land issue and land ownership, et cetera, which is a big challenge in the country, and finding solutions and creating a coalition at the end to advocate the solutions and implement them. So we've advocated a lot of solutions, and we measured our success in 5 annual assessments. And we had annual fora reaching 550 people. The last one was on March 10, filled up half of that grand ballroom at the Marriott. We invited a lot of people from government to speak and participate, and the media. And we measured gradual improvement each year in implementation of those recommendations. And as I said earlier, with high economic growth, we've got a record level of 3 years of above $6 billion in foreign investment. On legislation, there were landmark bills that were passed in the last 2 Congresses. I would just cite the Philippine Competition Act, which took 23 years to pass. And then when President Aquino named the commission, they just celebrated their first anniversary last week. They've staffed up to 100 economists and lawyers there, and that's important that they watch out over the atmosphere for competitiveness among businesses in the country and protect the consumer. There also was the CMTA. Things like the de minimis on imports at 10 pesos is gone up to 10,000, or the Balambaga box minimum is up. The creation of a DICT. So we've also tracked, and we have this up on our website, over 30 bills at each of the last 2 Congresses that improved the business reform. So we just allied with other business groups, Philippine business groups and business associations, on a legislative agenda, which was just in the newspapers yesterday, of 12 key reforms that we'd hope that could pass in the 17th Congress. So we work with others as partners to advocate reforms, and then that leads to more investment and more job creation.
Well, sir, we don't have much time, but I want to hear your thoughts about this. We have two current issues right now, and I just want to hear your opinion about this. Number one is that there are several mining firms who were ordered to stop its operations. What can you say about this? And number two, the contractualization policy here in the Philippines still concern a lot of employers and businesses.
Yep.
What do you think is the best thing to do so that more foreign businesses will invest and establish their shops here in the Philippines, and so that the businesses that have already established their shops here be not forced to leave?
Well, mining is controversial. I think people are surprised that the firms that were listed by Secretary Lopez in a press conference had not, as of yesterday, received any formal notice of what the government action is. Clearly, we have in our chamber and in other foreign chambers like the Japanese, the Australians, the Canadians, companies that do what we call responsible mining, where you mine an area even with an open pit, but after whatever it may be, 10 or 50 years, when the minerals are exhausted, then you rehabilitate it. You don't reconstruct the mountain the way it is before, but you can still bring in soil, and you can plant trees, and you can do a variety of things. So that's the kind of mining we think should take place in the Philippines. So the Philippines has a lot of potential for mining, and if you realize that potential, you will create more jobs, and there'll be more revenue both at the local level and at the national level. On manufacturing, there's a lot. Manufacturing is growing at 8%. A decade ago, it was growing at 4%. A decade before that, at 2%. So you can see a trend there. The manufacturing, labor-intensive manufacturing, unfortunately, has declined. If you take the footwear or the apparel industry, it's moved elsewhere, in spite of the fact that you have a lot of people that could work in it. And I suppose there you might advocate some ways in which you could, there are companies that employ 10 or 20,000 people to do clothing. We all need clothing, and there must be some ways to provide, some jobs there which are at the minimum wage, or the apprenticeship program where you don't have to pay the full wage, where companies can contribute to that. There are ways in which you can create more jobs in manufacturing than just at the higher end. Because I like to quote former Speaker Belmonte on the policies in this respect. We would meet as a group with Philippine business groups and foreign chambers with leadership of the House. And he said once, I do not want to see a future in which Filipino workers have to work in factories elsewhere in Southeast Asia to make goods that are exported to the Philippines that are paid for with their remittances, when they can stay at home, be with their families, and earn the same salary and spend on products made in the Philippines. So, because AFTA means the barriers to trade are down. So something can be made in Vietnam where the minimum wage is lower, with the government subsidized electricity. It's more challenging. So you'll have to be flexible here and be very aware. I worked in the NCC with Bill Luce of the fact that the competitors aren't sleeping. They're doing things to expand their economies. Like Vietnam exports have tripled in the last decade. The exports of goods here have stayed the same. Now, services, where the Philippines has a competitive advantage, has more than tripled in the last decade, so it's gone up. Now, if that can continue in services, there are lots of jobs there. The target of the industry is to reach 2 million by 2020, but let's also focus on manufacturing to get those exports up at a higher rate too. And I could go on, as I said earlier, for 2 hours and talk
No,
about this.
we're almost at the end of our program, but I'd like to ask, in your opinion as a member of the American Chamber of Commerce, what have you found out amongst your members as to the top 3 problems that American businesses are facing here in the Philippines?
I always get asked that sort of a question, so I guess the top one today would be infrastructure. And the administration's program, and even starting in the Aquino administration, where they were pushing GDP spending on infrastructure up to 5% of GDP. And they started some rail projects that within a few years will add 30 more light rail stations to our transport system here. Keeping the power on, which is not so much of a problem as it used to be. Solving the airport congestion and the traffic issues. So infrastructure is the #1 issue. Second has often been bureaucracy and red tape. Again, there are efforts to, Senator Zuberi gave a sponsorship speech yesterday of a bill on ease of doing business. NCC does a lot of work on that. The President has clearly emphasized his desire to make it much easier for individuals dealing with bureaucrats as well as businesses. And thirdly, I'd talk about, I made a reference to it on mining contracts, is contract, respect the contract. Don't change policies.
In the middle of the game.
In the middle. So policy consistency, contract recognition, those three, to answer your question, George, are, I think, are top concerns.
Do you have any final words, or would you like to invite Filipino companies to join the American Chamber, especially if they're doing business with American companies?
Absolutely. Filipino companies, whether you're in Manila at our national level, or Central Luzon, or in the Visayas or in Mindanao, we have chapters in all of those places. And just go to our website and you'll find some information on joining. We are been in the Philippines over 110 years, and we're very active, and we have, believe me, the interest of the Philippines, and we recognize the close ties with Filipinos here and Filipino Americans in the United States. You'll be extremely welcome to join us.
Can you tell our audience what your website is?
amchamphilippines.com. And for Arangkada, it's www.arangkadaphilippines. So, in fact, if you Google Arangkada, it'll pop up.
It'll
And I'm
pop
sure
up.
if you Google
All
Amcham Philippines, it'll pop up.
Okay, we need to end our program right now. At yan po ang isang napakagandang diskusyon kasama ang ating bisita ngayong gabi, si AmCham Senior Advisor, Mr. John Forbes.
Maaari niyo po kaming i-follow at i-like sa aming Facebook page, Usapang Bayan. Ako po si Rich Marquez.
At ako po si George Chua. Samahan niyo po kami muli sa mga susunod nating kabanata dito sa Usapang Bayan.